It was the kind of Saturday people dream about. Clear skies, warm air, and the scent of summer lingering in the breeze. For weeks, the homeowner had been planning a backyard barbecue. Friends and family were invited, the grill was cleaned and ready, and the lawn had been freshly mowed. The day was set to be perfect. Guests began arriving, bringing coolers, folding chairs, and laughter that echoed through the neighborhood. The sound of children running across the grass blended with the upbeat music playing softly from a portable speaker. The aroma of sizzling burgers and marinated chicken soon drifted over the fence lines, and one by one, neighbors peeked out of their homes. Most waved or even wandered over to join the fun. But of course, not every neighbor was smiling. 2 doors down lived Karen, the self-proclaimed protector of the neighborhood, who seemed to thrive on enforcing rules that didn't even exist. She had built her reputation on nitpicking everything. Trash cans left out a minute too long, cars parked slightly off-center, and even children riding bikes too loudly. It was no surprise that she would eventually turn her sights toward this barbecue. At first, Karen simply glared from her window, clutching a mug of coffee as if she were gathering evidence for some imaginary court case. When the music shifted to a slightly more upbeat playlist, she stormed into her backyard and began pacing along the fence line, huffing audibly in hopes that someone would notice her disapproval. She muttered to herself about noise ordinances, property values, and irresponsible behavior. As the evening sun dipped lower, the party grew livelier. Plates piled with food, laughter grew louder, and the kids lit up sparklers under careful supervision. That was the final straw for Karen. She marched back into her house, slamming her sliding door so loudly that several guests glanced over in surprise. Moments later, her blinds twitched open, and her phone appeared pressed to her ear. Everyone knew what was happening. Karen was calling the police. The guests exchanged uneasy looks, some suggesting the music be turned down or the sparklers put away. But the homeowner wasn't about to let a perfectly harmless, joyful gathering be ruined. The barbecue was well within local ordinances. It was on private property, and there were no HOA rules being broken. Still, a shadow of tension settled over the group. No one wanted to deal with flashing lights and stern questions. No one wanted the children frightened. As the minutes ticked by, people waited nervously, wondering whether Karen's latest stunt would escalate into something more serious. Sure enough, headlights appeared at the end of the street. A patrol car rolled slowly down, turning into the driveway with calm authority. Conversations fell silent. The sizzle of the grill became the only sound. Karen, standing proudly on her porch with crossed arms, smirked as though victory was already hers. But what happened next would turn the entire situation upside down. The police car door opened, and 2 officers stepped out, adjusting their belts and surveying the scene. From their perspective, nothing looked remotely criminal. A neatly kept backyard, a small group of adults chatting, kids playing with sparklers, and a barbecue grilling food. It looked more like a family reunion than a problem. Karen, however, wasted no time storming over to the officers, pointing dramatically toward the yard as if she had just uncovered some underground crime ring. She gestured wildly, listing supposed violations, noise disturbance, unsafe fire hazards, trespassing guests, and even claims of illegally burning toxic materials on the grill. She spoke quickly and confidently, as if her complaints alone would guarantee immediate citations and arrests. The officers listened patiently but with visible skepticism. One of them finally raised a hand, thanking her for the report and assuring her they would investigate. Karen folded her arms, clearly convinced she had won, and followed closely as the officers walked into the yard. The guests tensed. Parents pulled their kids a little closer, and the homeowner stepped forward, ready to explain. The officers glanced around, noting the modest speaker volume, the safe use of sparklers, and the tidy grill area. They asked a few standard questions. Was this a private gathering? Was alcohol being served responsibly? Were there any HOA restrictions in place? Each question was answered calmly and honestly, and the officers seemed satisfied. They even accepted a plate of food offered by one of the guests, though they politely declined to eat while on duty. Meanwhile, Karen lingered at the fence, her face flushing with frustration. She kept trying to interject, shouting accusations from behind the officers, but they largely ignored her. It was clear that she had exaggerated the situation. The officers then shifted their focus. Instead of reprimanding the homeowner, they quietly pulled Karen aside for a separate conversation. Her voice, once booming with confidence, suddenly grew defensive. She claimed she was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe, that she had every right to call the authorities, and that these kinds of parties could easily get out of hand. The officers didn't seem convinced. They reminded her that misuse of emergency services was a serious issue. They explained that wasting police time with exaggerated complaints took resources away from actual emergencies. Karen's smirk began to fade, replaced by a nervous tightness around her eyes. Back in the yard, the guests were beginning to relax again. The kids resumed playing, and the homeowner returned to tending the grill, though the tension still lingered. Everyone wanted to know, would the officers simply leave, or would Karen face consequences for her stunt? As the conversation at the fence grew more intense, Karen's raised voice carried over. She insisted she had been harassed by the very sight of the barbecue, and that her peaceful enjoyment of her home had been disrupted. But the officers had heard enough. They motioned for Karen to step away and followed her back toward her porch. The entire yard watched, waiting for the outcome. No one could have guessed just how badly things were about to backfire for her. By the time Karen reached her porch, she was visibly agitated. Her arms flailed as she tried to convince the officers she had been wronged. But instead of siding with her, they calmly reminded her that community complaints needed to be legitimate, not personal vendettas. She was warned that repeated false reports could result in fines or even charges. This only made Karen angrier. She raised her voice loud enough for the entire block to hear, insisting that the officers were incompetent, that the barbecue was a dangerous disruption, and that she would be taking this matter straight to the city council. Her words tumbled out faster, fueled by a mix of entitlement and panic. The officers remained composed, but their patience was thinning. One officer quietly noted her escalating behavior into his radio, ensuring there was a record of her actions. The other reminded her once again that she was wasting police time. Meanwhile, the guests were beginning to feel a strange mix of relief and amusement. The tension of the earlier confrontation had shifted into disbelief at how quickly Karen was unraveling. Some people exchanged knowing looks, while others quietly chuckled behind their hands. The children, oblivious to the drama, continued playing in the yard. Karen, however, was far from finished. She stomped back into her house, slamming the door, only to reappear moments later holding a thick binder. She waved it in the air, shouting about property deeds, zoning regulations, and neighborhood standards. It was as though she had been preparing for this moment her entire life, convinced she had enough evidence to shut down the barbecue once and for all. The officers, unimpressed, flipped through a few pages before handing the binder back. They explained that none of her documents supported her claims. The barbecue was legal. The music was within acceptable limits. The sparklers were permitted. There was simply no case. At this point, the guests couldn't help themselves. A few snickers slipped out, followed by muffled laughter. The sight of Karen, red-faced and waving papers, arguing with officers who refused to take her side, was too much. Even the homeowner cracked a smile, realizing that the entire situation was swinging in their favor. Karen noticed the laughter and exploded. She began shouting insults at the guests, accusing them of being lawbreakers, hoodlums, and disrespectful tenants. The officers immediately intervened, telling her to stop harassing her neighbors. When she continued, they warned her that disorderly conduct could have consequences. For the first time, Karen hesitated. The reality of her actions was starting to sink in. She had not only failed to shut down the barbecue, but had also turned herself into the spectacle of the evening. As the officers walked back toward their patrol car, Karen stood frozen on her porch, clutching her binder like a shield. The yard erupted into laughter, cheers, and applause. The homeowner raised a glass in celebration, thanking everyone for standing strong against her antics. But Karen wasn't quite done yet. From her porch, she shouted one final threat, that this wasn't over and that she would make them all pay. What she didn't realize was that her behavior had already set in motion a chain of events she couldn't escape. The barbecue resumed with renewed energy. Music picked up again, food was served in abundance, and the laughter grew louder. Guests joked that Karen had provided the night's entertainment, unintentionally making the gathering even more memorable. But the real twist came a few days later. The homeowner received a follow-up call from the police department. They explained that Karen's repeated misuse of emergency services had triggered an internal review. Her history of frivolous complaints, many of which had already been documented, was being examined, and she could be facing formal penalties. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents who had endured Karen's antics for years began sharing their own stories with the authorities. Complaints about her harassment, false reports, and aggressive confrontations piled up. The image she had worked so hard to project as the neighborhood watchdog was crumbling fast. Soon, a letter arrived at her home. She had been fined for filing a false report and issued a warning about future misuse of emergency services. On top of that, several neighbors filed harassment reports, which meant she was now under official scrutiny. Karen tried to save face, storming around the neighborhood claiming she was being targeted and persecuted. But her credibility was gone. Even those who once tolerated her had grown tired of her antics. Invitations to neighborhood events stopped coming. Conversations would fall silent when she walked by. She had become the very outcast she had always accused others of being. Meanwhile, the homeowner's barbecue became something of a legend. Neighbors who hadn't attended asked about it, laughing at the story of how Karen had embarrassed herself in front of everyone. The family was praised for staying calm under pressure and not letting her ruin their day. The barbecue was even jokingly referred to as the Karen cookout for months afterward. The next time the homeowner hosted a gathering, the turnout was bigger than ever. People brought extra food and lawn chairs, eager to be part of the fun. And this time, there were no interruptions. Karen stayed inside her house, curtains tightly drawn, her once powerful voice now reduced to bitter mutters that no one paid attention to. Her attempt to shut down a harmless barbecue had backfired spectacularly. Not only had she failed, but she had also exposed herself as the neighborhood's biggest problem. The very community she tried to control had united against her, and she would never regain the authority she thought she had. In the end, the barbecue wasn't just a meal shared among friends and family. It was a turning point. A reminder that kindness and patience will always outshine entitlement and control. And for Karen, it was a lesson she would never forget, whether she admitted it or not.